If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching us from. Let's continue. The morning in London began like all the others, with that characteristic bustle that made the city pulse from the early hours of the day. The still timid sun hid behind the immense buildings of Oxford Street, but movement already filled the wide pavements, packed with hurried people, each carrying their own story, their own dreams, their own silent battles. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the aroma of toasted bread wafting from crowded bakeries, where executives in suits queued alongside delivery riders, all united by the same need to start the day, with that dose of energy that only the capital city knew how to demand. Mary Ann Davies observed all this from the window of her 12th-floor apartment in a residential building on Regent Street, just a few blocks from Oxford Street. She held a cup of coffee between her hands, feeling the warmth of the porcelain heat her fingers as her eyes scanned the urban landscape that stretched as far as the eye could see. 10 years. 10 years had passed since she arrived in London from Bristol, at just 22 years old, with an old suitcase full of simple clothes and a heart overflowing with dreams that seemed too big for a country girl. But she had made it. Against all odds, against all obstacles, against all the nights she cried from exhaustion and loneliness. In that same apartment that was now her refuge, she had built a solid career as an architect in one of the city's most respected firms. Mary Ann took a deep breath, feeling the weight of that achievement and also the weight of everything she had left behind to get there. Not just the small town where she was born, not just the family that remained distant, but also pieces of herself that she had buried so deep that sometimes she could go entire days without remembering they existed. Almost. Her phone vibrated on the coffee table, bringing Mary Ann back to the present. It was a message from Helen Castle, her best friend since architecture school. Helen, always cheerful, always positive, always full of plans and contagious enthusiasm. "Mary, good morning, my love. Don't forget about lunch today, okay? Laura and I are dying to see you. 12 sharp at that Italian restaurant you love. Kisses." Mary Ann smiled, but it was a smile that carried something melancholic, something she wouldn't be able to explain if someone asked. Helen was the only person in London who truly knew her, or at least who knew the version of Mary Ann she allowed to be known. They had become close in their first semester of university, two country girls trying to find their way in the immensity of that frightening and fascinating metropolis. Helen came from Cambridge, from a traditional family, with a surname that opened doors and resources that smoothed the path. Mary Ann came from a very different reality, the daughter of a carpenter and a primary school teacher, simple, hard-working people who had saved every penny to give their daughter the chance to study in the capital. Despite their differences, their friendship had blossomed quickly and genuinely. Helen was generous, lending expensive books, sharing notes, inviting Mary Ann to parties and events, where she met people who would later become important for her career. Mary Ann, in turn, brought to Helen a lightness and authenticity, a way of seeing the world that was not, contaminated by the weight of family and social expectations that always pressured her friend. But there was something Helen never knew. Something Mary Ann kept locked in such a secret compartment of her soul that sometimes she herself convinced herself that it had never happened. A mistake, a weakness, an unforgivable betrayal that, if revealed, would destroy not only the most important friendship of her life, but also the image Helen had of her, the image Mary Ann had of herself. She shook her head, pushing away the dark thoughts that were beginning to form like heavy clouds on a day that promised a storm. Today was Monday, a day for new beginnings, a day to focus on work. And work was precisely the reason why she couldn't afford to delve into memories that only brought pain. Mary Ann finished her coffee, took a quick but invigorating shower, put on a discreet but elegant business suit, a navy blazer over a white blouse and black tailored trousers, tied her dark brown hair in a low practical bun, applied a nude lipstick that enhanced her lips without drawing too much attention, and left the house with the determination of someone who knew exactly what she needed to do. The architectural firm was in the financial heart of Oxford Street, in one of those mirrored glass buildings that reflected the sky and created the illusion of touching the clouds. Mary Ann had worked at Maxwell and Associates for 8 years, ever since she finished her internship, and was hired as a junior architect. In that time, she had proven her worth project after project, earned the trust of the partners, climbed the ranks, gained autonomy, and built a reputation as a meticulous, creative, and absolutely reliable professional. Upon entering the office, Mary Ann greeted the receptionist with a polite nod, grabbed a coffee from the pantry, and headed to her desk, a spacious and organized workstation filled with models, architectural plans, and a state-of-the-art digital drafting tablet. She loved that space. Here, surrounded by lines, measurements, concepts, and possibilities, she felt safe. Architecture had clear rules, proportions that made sense, structures that could be calculated and predicted. All the opposite of real life, where emotions didn't follow floor plans and hearts didn't respect structural designs. She had barely turned on her computer when Fabian Maxwell, one of the firm's founding partners, appeared beside her desk with a wide, excited smile. "Mary Ann, good morning. I need to talk to you. Meeting room in 5 minutes. Can you make it?" Mary Ann raised her eyebrows, intrigued. Fabian was a man in his 60s, with grey hair, discreet glasses, always impeccably dressed with an energy that defied his age. He rarely called individual meetings without prior notice. "Of course, Fabian. Any news?" "Big news," he replied, his eyes sparkling with that excitement Mary Ann recognized well. It was the expression of someone about to present an important project. "You're going to love it." 5 minutes later, Mary Ann was sitting in one of the upholstered chairs in the meeting room, facing Fabian and a brown leather folder he placed on the glass table with an almost theatrical gesture. "Mary Ann, Charles and I have discussed this a lot over the past few days and concluded that you are the ideal person to lead the firm's next major project." Mary Ann felt her heart race. Big projects meant big responsibilities, but also big opportunities. It was exactly the kind of challenge she had been seeking, one that would prove once and for all that she was not just competent, but exceptional. "I'm listening," she said, trying to keep her voice calm despite the excitement beginning to grow within her. Fabian opened the folder and slid some photographs across the table. They were images of an old building, with classical architecture, featuring Art Deco details that harked back to the 1940s, a golden age of construction in London. The facade was weathered, but it was still possible to see its original beauty, its grandeur, the historical character that made that building special amidst the sea of concrete and glass that dominated Oxford Street. "This is the St. Clair building," Fabian began, his voice taking on an almost reverent tone. "It was built in 1943 by one of the most important architects of the era. It's right there on Oxford Street, at the corner of Charing Cross Road, and for decades it belonged to the Castle family, one of London's most traditional families." Mary Ann felt something tighten in her chest at hearing that surname. Castle. It couldn't be. There were many castles in London. It was a common surname. It didn't necessarily mean it had any connection to Helen. "The current owner is Roderick Castle," Fabian continued, and Mary Ann had to make a conscious effort to maintain a neutral expression. He inherited the building from his father, who passed away 2 years ago. Roderick is an entrepreneur, with some businesses in the technology sector, and he decided to completely renovate the building to transform it into a cultural space, with a library, cafe, co-working spaces, art gallery, auditorium. A beautiful, ambitious project that will return that historic building to the city in a completely new way. And he approached us to do the renovation project, Mary Ann concluded, her mind already working, on the possibilities, trying not to think about the fact that Roderick Castle was Helen's brother, the older brother she often mentioned, but whom Mary Ann had never met personally. Exactly. And he was very clear. He wants a professional who understands historical preservation, who respects the soul of the building, but who also has a contemporary vision to create something innovative. "Mary Ann, I thought of you immediately. You have sensitivity, you have technique, you have the vision this project needs." Mary Ann felt a mixture of pride, anxiety, and something akin to fear. It was the opportunity she had always wanted, but the circumstances were complicated in a way Fabian could never imagine. When would the first meeting with the client be? Tomorrow, Tuesday, at 3 in the afternoon. Right here, in the office. Roderick wants to meet the team, discuss initial ideas, understand our approach. Marianne took a deep breath. There was no way to refuse. There was no professional reason to refuse. And maybe, just maybe, working with Roderick would be completely neutral, professional, without any complications. "I accept," she said, and as she spoke those words, she had the strange sensation that she was opening a door she would no longer be able to close. The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings, emails, calls, and planning. Marianne plunged into work with the intensity that always characterized her, researching everything she could find about the St. Clair building, its history, its original architects, the architectural features that needed to be preserved. She made extensive notes, created organized digital folders, began sketching preliminary ideas, all to prepare for the next day's meeting. When noon arrived, Marianne grabbed her bag and headed to the Italian restaurant where she would meet Helen and Laura. The place was a few blocks from the office, a cozy and charming establishment with dark wooden tables, red and white checkered tablecloths, and that unmistakable smell of homemade tomato sauce and fresh basil that instantly made anyone hungry. Helen was already there, sitting at a table near the window, and beside her was Laura, a 14-year-old girl, tall for her age, slender, with light brown hair that fell straight to her shoulders, almond-shaped eyes that sparkled with a lively intelligence, and a smile that lit up her face in a way that always made Marianne's heart ache in a way she couldn't explain. "Mary!" Helen stood up and hugged her friend with that enthusiasm that never diminished, no matter how many times they saw each other. "I've missed you, girl. You've been scarce, haven't you?" "Sorry, Helen. You know how it is, non-stop work." "Aunt Marianne." Laura also stood up and hugged Marianne, and at that moment, with the girl in her arms, Marianne felt something she always felt when she was near Laura, an inexplicable connection, a devastating tenderness, a pain she didn't know if it was real or just the fruit of her guilty imagination. The three sat down and ordered their food. Helen spoke animatedly about the psychology clinic she ran, about the interesting cases she had attended, about a conference she was organizing. Laura talked about school, about the approaching exams, about a science project she was developing on sustainable architecture that, according to her, had been inspired by conversations she had with Aunt Marianne. Marianne listened, smiled, participated in the conversation, but a part of her was distant, observing Laura with an attention that went beyond a godmother's affection. Every gesture, every expression, every mannerism. She looked for similarities. She looked for confirmations. She looked for answers to questions that had haunted her for years. Could it be possible? Laura was 14. The daughter Marianne had given up for adoption 15 years ago would be exactly that age. The dates matched. The city matched. The details Helen had mentioned over the years about the adoption process, always discreetly, respectfully, matched. But Marianne never had the courage to ask directly, never had the courage to confirm. Because if it were true, what would she do? How would she deal with the fact that the daughter she had abandoned was being raised by her best friend, without either of them knowing the connection that bound them? "Mary, are you okay?" Helen's voice brought her back. "You seemed a bit distant just now." "Sorry, Helen. It's just that I received some important news at work today. I'm going to lead a big project. I'm a bit anxious." "How wonderful. Tell me everything." Marianne hesitated for a second, but then decided there was no reason to hide it. "It's the renovation of the St. Clair building, that old building on Oxford Street." Helen's face lit up in genuine surprise. "Seriously? But that building belongs to my family. It's my father's building, which is now Roderick's." Marianne felt her stomach churn. Of course. She already knew that, but hearing Helen confirm it made everything more real, more complicated. "Yes, I'll have the first meeting with him tomorrow." "Mary, what an incredible coincidence. You have to meet my brother. He's wonderful, super dedicated, a bit of a workaholic, I confess. But he has a huge heart. Ever since he separated from Camilla, He's been a bit reclusive, but I'm sure you two will work together brilliantly. Mary Ann forced a smile. I'm sure too. But inside she knew none of this would be simple. Nothing ever was simple when the past insisted on mixing with the present, when buried secrets began to dig their way back to the surface. The next morning, Tuesday, Mary Ann woke up earlier than usual. She had slept poorly, confused and restless dreams disturbing her shallow, interrupted sleep. She prepared with even more care than usual, choosing a simple but elegant emerald green dress that highlighted her greenish-brown eyes, discreet but impeccable makeup, medium-heeled shoes that added elegance without exaggeration. She wanted to make a good professional impression. That's what she told herself. But deep down, a part of her wondered if there wasn't something more behind that excessive concern for appearance. At 2:45 in the afternoon, Mary Ann was in the meeting room, reviewing for the 10th time the notes she had prepared, the initial sketches, the references from similar projects. Fabian entered the room a few minutes later, accompanied by Charles, the other partner, and 2 junior architects who would be part of the team. And then, promptly at 3 o'clock, the receptionist announced the client's arrival. Roderick Castle entered the room and Mary Ann literally felt, the air change. He was tall, must have been about 6'1", broad shoulders, a confident but not arrogant posture, dark hair elegantly but naturally swept back, also dark eyes that seemed to absorb everything around with sharp intelligence. He wore a white shirt, with sleeves rolled up to his elbows, grey dress trousers, and a wristwatch that even from a distance Mary Ann recognized as expensive but discreet. He had that presence that some people simply possess, that combination of natural charm, self-assurance, and something vulnerable that made him human, approachable, interesting. Roderick greeted Fabian with a firm handshake, then Charles, then the other team members, and then his eyes met Mary Ann's. He paused for a fraction of a second. Just a fraction, but it was enough for Mary Ann to notice. He extended his hand and she shook it, feeling the warmth of his palm against hers, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time, something that left her completely off balance. Mary Ann Davies, Fabian made the introductions. She will be the lead architect for the project. Nice to meet you, Mary Ann, Roderick said, and his voice was deep, warm, with a softness that contrasted with the firmness of his presence. Fabian told me a lot about you. I'm looking forward to working together. The pleasure is mine, Roderick, Mary Ann replied, and realized her own voice came out lower than she intended, almost too intimate for a first professional meeting. They sat around the table, and the meeting began. Roderick explained his vision for the building, the historical importance that place had for his family, the desire to transform it into something that would serve the city. That would be a space for gathering, culture, creation. He spoke with passion, with knowledge, but also with a humility that impressed Mary Ann. He wasn't an authoritarian client wanting to impose ideas. He was someone genuinely interested in collaborating, in listening, in building something special together with the team. Mary Ann presented her preliminary research, showed references, discussed possibilities for preservation and innovation, and as the conversation flowed, she noticed something disturbing. There was a connection between them, a synergy. Roderick understood what she was saying before she even finished her sentences. He asked intelligent questions, laughed at her comments, looked at her in a way that went beyond the professional, as if he was truly seeing her, not just as the project's architect, but as Mary Ann, the person. The meeting lasted almost 2 hours. When it ended, everyone left satisfied, excited, full of ideas. Roderick said goodbye to the team, and upon reaching Mary Ann, he hesitated for a moment. Mary Ann, I know my sister Helen is your best friend. She told me you two had lunch yesterday and that you mentioned the project. Mary Ann nodded, her heart pounding. She spoke wonders about you, Roderick continued, and now I understand why. It was a pleasure meeting you. I'm sure we'll do incredible work together. I'm sure too, Mary Ann said, and this time she wasn't just being polite. Roderick smiled, that smile that lit up his entire face, and left the room. Mary Ann stood there, feeling her heart beat too hard, too fast. She knew what that meant. She recognized the signs, the attraction, the interest, the inexplicable connection that happens between two people and follows no logic, asks no permission, waits for no right moment. But she also knew that it was impossible. Roderick was Helen's brother, and Helen was the friend she had betrayed in an unforgivable way 15 years ago, even if Helen had never found out. How could Mary Ann get close to Roderick, carrying that weight? How could she allow something to grow between them, knowing the secret that haunted her? She went back to her desk, tried to concentrate on work, but it was useless. Her mind was elsewhere, divided between professional excitement for the project and the growing fear of what might happen if she let her feelings speak louder than her reason. That night, in her silent apartment, Mary Ann stood on the balcony looking at the lights of the city that never slept. She thought of Roderick. She thought of Helen. She thought of Laura. She thought of the past she had tried to bury and that now seemed determined to resurface from the depths where she had left it. And for the first time in many years, Mary Ann wondered if it would be possible to have a second chance, if it would be possible to mend the mistakes of the past, if it would be possible to be happy without destroying everything around her. But the answer to those questions was still shrouded in shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The following weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, technical visits to the St. Clair building, structural surveys, feasibility studies, and endless brainstorming sessions with the team. Mary Ann threw herself into work with a dedication that bordered on obsession, as if by keeping constantly busy she could silence the thoughts that insisted on taking over her mind whenever there was a moment of silence. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't ignore the fact that with each meeting with Roderick, the connection between them deepened. It wasn't just physical attraction, although that was definitely present in a way Mary Ann hadn't experienced in years. It was something deeper, more disturbing. They thought similarly. They shared the same sense of humor. Roderick had a sensitivity for architecture and historical preservation that surprised Mary Ann, and she discovered that he had studied art history before moving into business administration, which explained a lot about how he saw the building project. During visits to the building, they walked together through the old corridors, climbed the marble stairs worn by time, examined the Art Deco details on the bronze, doors, the stained glass windows that still resisted in the upper windows, the mosaic floors that told silent stories of decades past. And in each of those moments, Roderick recounted childhood memories of when he visited the building with his father, of when he ran through the empty corridors imagining he was an explorer discovering an ancient castle. "My father loved this place," Roderick said on a rainy April afternoon as they stood on the top floor, before a panoramic window overlooking all of Oxford Street. "He always said that old buildings have a soul, that they hold the energy of all the people who passed through there, of all the stories that happened within their walls." Mary Ann looked at him, seeing the genuine emotion in his dark eyes, the way his voice became lower, more intimate. "I believe that too," she replied softly. "That's why historical preservation is so important. We're not just saving physical structures, we're saving memories, identities, pieces of our collective history." Roderick looked at her in a way that made Mary Ann's heart race. "Exactly. You understand. Most people don't understand, but you do." There was a charged silence between them, with only the sound of rain hitting the old glass panes. Mary Ann felt she should say something, break that moment before it became something impossible to ignore. But she couldn't. She stood there, looking at Roderick, feeling something grow inside her, something she had sworn never to allow again. It was Roderick who broke the silence, clearing his throat lightly and turning his attention back to the architectural plans Mary Ann had brought. "So, about the auditorium on the 3rd floor." They returned to professionalism, but something had changed. A line had been crossed, even if silently, even if neither of them admitted. It allowed. That same week, Helen called Mary Ann, inviting her to dinner at her house on Saturday. It was something that happened regularly. Helen loved to host friends, cook, transform her home into a welcoming space full of laughter and conversations that stretched into the early hours. Mary Ann accepted, as she always did, but this time with an anxiety she couldn't disguise even from herself. Helen's house was in an upscale neighborhood in West London, a modern and elegant construction with a large garden, swimming pool and a gourmet area where she loved to host her dinners. When Marianne arrived on Saturday night, bringing a bottle of wine and a bouquet of flowers, she found the house already full of guests. There were colleagues from Helen's clinic, some mutual friends from university, Laura helping her mother serve appetizers, and, to Marianne's surprise and secret terror, Roderick was there too. He was in the gourmet area, helping with the barbecue, casually dressed in a blue button-down shirt and jeans, his hair a little messy from the wind, and when his eyes met Marianne's through the window glass, he smiled in that way that made something tighten in her chest. "Mary, finally!" Helen appeared, giving her friend a tight hug. "Come on, so many people want to see you. And you already know my brother, of course, you're working together on the project." "Yes, we've met," Marianne said, trying to keep her voice natural. Helen dragged her through the house, introducing people, sharing news, chattering non-stop in her usual lively way. At some point, Marianne found herself sitting in one of the chairs around the large table in the gourmet area, with Laura sitting beside her, talking excitedly about a book she was reading. "It's about an architect who travels the world documenting old buildings," Laura explained, her eyes shining, and she discovers that her grandmother, whom she never knew, was also an architect and had designed one of the most famous buildings in Europe. "It's beautiful, Aunt Marianne. It makes me think a lot about you." "About me?" Marianne asked, her heart aching. "Yes. You always talk about how architecture is a way to leave a legacy, to create something that will last beyond our lives. I think that's beautiful. Sometimes I wonder who I am, where I come from, what traits I inherited. Mum always says I inherited her intelligence and Granddad's heart." Laura smiled, but there was something melancholic in that smile. "But I'm curious about my biological family too. Not that it changes anything about the love I feel for Mum and Uncle Roderick, but it's natural to be curious, isn't it?" Marianne felt her throat tighten. She wanted to say so many things. She wanted to hug that girl and say she understood, that curiosity was valid, that there were answers she could give if only she had the courage. But all she could do was nod slightly and hold Laura's hand for a moment. "It's very natural to be curious, Laura, and there's nothing wrong with that. Does your mum know you think about this?" "She knows. We talk about it sometimes. She's super open, never hid that I'm adopted, always made me feel safe to ask questions. But I also don't want her to think I'm not grateful, or that she's not enough, because she's everything to me." "I'm sure your mum knows that," Marianne said, her voice choked. Roderick approached at that moment, bringing a tray of meat skewers. He had just taken off the barbecue. "Girls, try these before everyone devours them," he said, placing the tray on the table, and then, looking at Laura with obvious affection. "And you, young lady, are you monopolizing Aunt Marianne? Let me talk to her too." Laura laughed and stood up. "Okay, Uncle, I'll help Mum with dessert." Roderick sat in the chair Laura had vacated, taking a seat beside Marianne. There were other people at the table, cross-conversations happening at various points, but somehow it was as if only the two of them were there. "Are you okay?" Roderick asked softly, in a way only she could hear. "You seem a bit distant today." Marianne looked at him, surprised by his perception. "I'm fine, just thoughtful. About the project? About many things." Roderick nodded as if he understood, and they remained in comfortable silence for a few moments, just observing the movement of the party around them. "Marianne," he said finally, his voice still low, laden with something she couldn't quite decipher. "Can I ask you a personal question?" She felt her heart race. "You can. Are you married? Are you dating anyone?" Marianne blinked, not expecting such a direct question. "No, I'm not involved with anyone." Roderick nodded slowly, and there was something relieved in his expression. "Helen told me you're very reserved about your personal life, that ever since she's known you, you rarely get involved with anyone." "Your sister talks too much," Marianne said, but there was no irritation in her voice, just a slight amusement. "She talks because she worries. She says you're incredible, talented, beautiful, but that you hide behind your work, that sometimes it seems like you carry some weight that doesn't let anyone get close." Marianne felt her eyes sting. It was impressive how Helen, even without knowing anything, could see through the mask she wore. "And you? she asked, shifting the focus to him. Helen mentioned you recently separated. Roderick sighed. A year and a half ago. I was married for 6 years to a woman who, in the end, we realized wanted very different things from life. It wasn't bad. There were no fights, no betrayal, nothing dramatic. Just, we grew in different directions. She wanted to live outside the UK, pursue her international career. I couldn't leave London, my family, my businesses. So, we decided to separate on good terms. That must have been difficult. It was, but sometimes the right thing to do is the hardest. They looked at each other, and there were so many layers in that exchange of glances that Mary Ann felt she was drowning. It was Helen who interrupted them, arriving with a huge tray of homemade tiramisu and announcing loudly that dessert was served. The party continued. People ate, laughed, talked, and as the night wore on, some guests began to leave. Around midnight, only Mary Ann, Roderick, Laura, and Helen remained. They were sitting outside, under the starry sky, with the soft sound of a jazz playlist playing in the background. Laura had fallen asleep on one of the loungers, wrapped in a light blanket, breathing peacefully. Helen looked at her daughter with that infinite tenderness that only a mother has and smiled. She grew up so fast. It feels like yesterday I held her for the first time, that tiny baby who fit in my arms. Mary Ann felt a pang in her chest. Do you remember that day? As if it were today, Helen replied, her eyes shining with tears of happiness. It was on March 15th, 14 years ago. The social worker called me saying there was a baby, that she had just been born, that the biological mother had voluntarily surrendered her, but left no information beyond her health conditions. When I first saw her in the hospital, Mary, I knew she was my daughter. It didn't matter that she didn't come from my body. She was mine. Mary Ann was rigid in her chair, barely able to breathe. March 15th. 14 years ago. It was the date. It was the city. It was everything. Was it a quick adoption? She asked, her voice strangely neutral for the whirlwind of emotions she felt inside. Relatively. The biological mother had signed all the documentation at the hospital, making it clear she didn't want any future contact, that she wanted the child to be adopted by a family that could give her everything she couldn't. The process took a few months, but yes, it was faster than usual. Roderick, who had been listening in silence, placed his hand on his sister's shoulder. And you gave her everything you could and more. Laura is an incredible girl, Helen. You are an incredible mother. Thank you, Roderick. You're an incredible uncle, too. I don't know what we'd do without you, especially after Dad passed. They fell silent for a few moments, each lost in their own thoughts. Mary Ann was struggling to maintain her composure, not to break down right there and confess everything. It was Laura. It had to be Laura. All the details matched. But how could she be absolutely sure? What if it was just a cruel coincidence? Mary, are you okay? Helen asked, noticing her friend's paleness. You've been very quiet. I'm just tired, Helen. It's been a tough week at work. Of course, sorry I talk too much as always. Do you want me to call you an Uber? I'll take her, Roderick offered immediately, standing up. I'm leaving anyway, and her apartment is on the way. Mary Ann wanted to refuse, but couldn't find a reasonable excuse. She said goodbye to Helen with a prolonged hug, gave a light kiss on sleeping Laura's forehead, and followed Roderick to his car, an elegant black sedan parked on the street. The drive to Mary Ann's apartment was initially silent, with only the sound of London's night traffic filling the space. The streets were emptier at this hour, the streetlights creating hypnotic patterns of light and shadow inside the car. Mary Ann. Roderick finally broke the silence when they stopped at a red light. I need to be honest with you. She looked at him, her heart pounding. Ever since I met you, I can't stop thinking about you, he continued, keeping his eyes fixed on the traffic light, as if it were easier to say those words without looking directly at her. I know it's complicated. I know we work together, that you're my sister's best friend, that there are 1,000 reasons why this isn't a good idea. But I needed you to know, I needed to be honest. The traffic light turned green, and he started driving again, but the silence now was charged with a completely different tension. Roderick, Mary Ann said, her voice coming out weaker than she intended. You don't have to answer now, he interrupted gently. I'm not asking for anything. I'm just being sincere about what I feel. And if you don't feel the same, that's fine. We can continue working together professionally, no problem. I know how to separate things. But Marianne knew she couldn't separate them, because she felt the same. She felt it so intensely that it frightened her, and that was exactly why it was impossible. When they arrived at her building, Roderick parked in front of the entrance and turned to look at her. "Thanks for the ride," Marianne said, her hand already on the door handle. "Marianne, wait." She stopped, looking at him. "I said you don't have to answer now, but I would really like to see you outside of a professional context. Dinner, coffee, a walk in the park, anything. Would you be up for it?" Marianne closed her eyes, fighting against everything she felt. "Roderick, I can't. There are things you don't know, things from my past that complicate everything." "Then tell me," he said simply. "Let me get to know the real you. Not just the brilliant architect everyone sees, but the complete Marianne with everything she carries." And it was at that moment, with that kind and sincere man asking to truly know her, that Marianne realized the depth of the hole she had dug for herself. Because how could she tell him? How could she reveal that 15 years ago she had betrayed her best friend's trust in an unforgivable way? How could she tell him that she had gotten pregnant and given the child up for adoption without ever looking back? How could she tell him that this child was probably Laura, the niece he loved so much? "I need to go," she said, opening the car door. "Marianne." She stopped once more without turning around. "I'll wait. When you're ready to talk, to trust me, I'll be here." Marianne got out of the car and entered the building, without looking back, but she could feel his eyes on the back of her neck. When she reached her apartment, she locked the door, leaned her back against it, and finally allowed the tears to fall. She had spent 15 years building a life based on silences and secrets, a life where no one got too close, where no one asked difficult questions, where she controlled every narrative about who she was and where she came from. But now, with Roderick entering her life, with Laura growing up and asking questions about her origins, with Helen being so happy and complete without knowing the truth that could destroy her, Marianne felt the walls she had built begin to crack, and she didn't know if she could stop everything from collapsing. In the following days, Marianne tried to keep her distance from Roderick, limiting their interactions to strictly professional matters, but it was impossible. They had daily meetings, needed to make decisions together, coordinate teams, and each encounter was a sweet torture. She saw the way he looked at her, noticed the small gestures of attention, the consideration, the genuine respect he had for her ideas and opinions. And the more she got to know Roderick, the more she fell in love. It wasn't just attraction, it was admiration, compatibility, the recognition of someone who could be a true partner, not just romantically, but in all aspects of life. But the weight of the secret was suffocating. On a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after the dinner at Helen's house, Marianne was alone in the St. Clair building doing a detailed photographic survey when she heard footsteps echoing down the empty corridor. It was Roderick. He wasn't scheduled to be there that day. "Hi," he said, stopping at the door of the room where she was. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "No, it's fine. I was just taking some photos for documentation." Roderick entered the room, looking around with that thoughtful expression she knew well. "You know, I had an idea. For the ground floor cafe, I thought about curating a special selection of local art. London artists, not necessarily famous, but talented, giving visibility to those who are starting out. What do you think?" "I think it's a beautiful idea," Marianne replied sincerely. "It transforms the space into something more than just commercial. It gives it purpose." "Exactly." They fell silent, the afternoon light streaming through the dirty windows and creating golden patterns on the floor. "Marianne," Roderick said, his voice more serious, "you're avoiding me." She didn't deny it. There was no point in denying it. "I am." "Why?" "Because it's complicated, Roderick. Very complicated. Everything worthwhile is complicated. It's not just that. There are things that I did, decisions I made, mistakes I committed. If you knew..." maybe you wouldn't look at me the same way. Roderick took a few steps towards her, stopping at a respectful distance. Marianne, I'm not naive. I know everyone has a past, everyone carries regrets. But what matters is who you are today, and the person I know is principled, dedicated, sensitive, intelligent. Whatever happened before doesn't change that. You don't understand. It involves your family, it involves Helen. His expression changed, becoming more serious. What involves Helen? Marianne felt she had said too much. She shook her head. I can't tell you. At least not now. Then when? When will you trust me? I don't know if I can, Roderick. I don't know if I can risk it. He was silent for a long moment, and then said something that broke Marianne's heart. You're not protecting yourself or my sister, Marianne. You're hiding. There's a difference. He turned and left the room, leaving Marianne alone with her photographs, her architectural plans, and the overwhelming weight of the truth she couldn't reveal. That night, Marianne did something she hadn't done in 15 years. She took out an old box she kept at the back of her closet, a box she had never opened since moving to London. Inside were documents, old photographs, and among them a time-yellowed envelope. With trembling hands, she opened the envelope and took out the only record she had of the daughter she had given up for adoption. A photocopy of the provisional birth certificate before the adoption was finalized. There was no photo. There was no name. Just a date. March 15th, 15 years ago, and a city. London. Tears fell onto the paper, staining the already faded ink. Marianne knew what she had to do. She needed to be sure. She needed to confirm if Laura was truly her biological daughter before making any decisions about Roderick, about the future, about anything. But how? How to find out without destroying everything? The answer came a few days later in a way she didn't expect. Helen called saying Laura had started a school project on genetics and family trees and was curious about doing a DNA test to discover her ethnic origins. As an adoptive mother, Helen felt it was important to support this curiosity, but she was also a little apprehensive about what Laura might discover or how she might feel. Mary, I know it's a bit silly, but I'm nervous. What if she discovers something and it changes the way she sees me? What if she wants to look for her biological family and they don't want to meet her? Marianne, on the other end of the line, was paralyzed. Helen, Laura loves you. Nothing will change that. I know. Rationally, I know. But a mother's heart has these fears, you know? I know, Marianne whispered. And so, at that moment, a terrible and necessary idea began to form in Marianne's mind. If Laura was going to do a DNA test, maybe she could too. Maybe, somehow, she could discover the truth without having to reveal the secret. Yet, it was risky. It was unethical. It was wrong in so many ways, but it was the only way out she could see. And as the days passed, and the building project advanced, and her feelings for Roderick grew, and the weight of the secret became more and more unbearable, Marianne knew she couldn't postpone it any longer. The truth was coming, whether she wanted it or not. And when it arrived, it would change everything forever. The month of May brought with it cooler weather to London, with foggy mornings that covered the city like a grey, cloak and afternoons that alternated between timid sun and sudden showers. Marianne barely noticed the weather changes. Her mind was consumed by a single obsessive thought, the DNA test. She had discreetly bought a kit at a pharmacy far from her neighbourhood, following the instructions with almost scientific care, collecting the saliva sample, sealing the envelope, sending it to the lab. Now it was just a matter of waiting for the results, waiting for the confirmation that would change everything, or the negative that would leave her with even more questions. The days dragged on with torturous slowness. At the office, Marianne forced herself to concentrate on the St. Clair building project, which was progressing beautifully. Restoration work had already begun, with a specialized team carefully working on the facade, cleaning decades of pollution and grime, gradually revealing the original beauty of the Art Deco. Inside, demolition work on walls that had been improperly added over the years also progressed, restoring the main halls to their original, grand and elegant proportions. Roderick was present almost every day, following every detail, making suggestions, discussing solutions with Mary Ann. Since the tense conversation they had in the empty building, he had maintained a respectful distance, not speaking again about his feelings, not pressing but also not completely hiding the meaningful gaze he directed at her whenever their eyes met. One Friday afternoon, 2 weeks after Mary Ann had sent her DNA sample, she and Roderick were on the 3rd floor of the building, discussing the layout of the future auditorium. There were plans spread over an improvised table, material samples, acoustic studies, and they were so absorbed in the technical discussion that they didn't notice when Helen entered the floor, bringing Laura with her. "Surprise," Helen announced cheerfully, making the two turn around startled. "I was passing by here after picking Laura up from school and thought I'd sneak a peek at the project. I hope we're not interrupting." "Of course not, Helen," Roderick replied, going to hug his sister and then Laura. "You're always welcome." Mary Ann watched the scene with a pang in her chest. The way Roderick interacted with Laura was beautiful to see. There was genuine affection, complicity, a protectiveness that went beyond the role of uncle. He truly loved that girl as if she were his own daughter. "Aunt Mary Ann!" Laura came running and hugged Mary Ann with that characteristic enthusiasm of adolescence. "What an amazing place. I've never been here before." "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Mary Ann replied, returning the hug, trying not to think about all the time she held that girl and wondered if she was hugging her own daughter. "Roderick told me there's going to be a library here. Is that true?" "Yes, it is. 3 complete floors of library, with reading areas, study rooms, even a special collection of rare books." Laura's eyes sparkled. "I'm going to spend all my weekends here when it opens." Helen laughed and put her arm around her daughter's shoulders. "I don't doubt it. You and your books." They stayed for about 20 more minutes, with Helen asking questions about the project, and Laura exploring the spaces with charming curiosity. When they finally said goodbye and left, Mary Ann and Roderick were silent for a moment. "She's special," Mary Ann said softly, still looking at the door through which Laura had left. "She is. My sister was very lucky to have her. Or maybe Laura was lucky to have Helen as a mother." Roderick looked at her thoughtfully. "You talk about this with so much emotion. About adoption. About motherhood." Mary Ann felt her blood run cold. "It's a topic that touches me," she said, trying to keep her voice neutral. "I think motherhood, in all its forms, is something very powerful." "Do you want to have children someday?" The question caught her off guard. I don't know. It's complicated." "Everything with you seems to be complicated, Mary Ann." There was no accusation in his voice, just a resigned sadness. "I know. And I'm sorry for that." "You don't need to apologize. I just wish you trusted me enough to let me in." Mary Ann took a deep breath, gathering all the courage she had. "Roderick, can you meet me for dinner tonight? Away from work, away from your family context. Just the two of us. I need to talk to you about some things." His expression changed immediately, a mixture of surprise and hope. "Of course, what time?" 8 o'clock. I know a discreet restaurant in Shoreditch. I'll meet you there." The rest of the afternoon passed in an anxious fog. Mary Ann returned to the office, finished some pending tasks, and then went home to get ready. She took a long shower, carefully chose a simple but elegant wine-colored dress, left her hair down, applied light makeup. Looking at herself in the mirror, she tried to mentally rehearse what she would say, how she would start the conversation, how she would explain 15 years of silence and secrets. But no matter how many times she tried to formulate the words, nothing seemed adequate. The restaurant she had chosen was small and cozy, with low lighting, rustic wooden tables, and an intimate atmosphere that seemed perfect for difficult conversations. Mary Ann arrived first and chose a table in the corner, away from curious glances. Roderick appeared promptly at 8, casually but impeccably dressed in a black shirt and dark jeans. When his eyes met Mary Ann's, he smiled, and in that smile there was so much hope that she felt her heart ache with anticipated guilt. They ordered food, made light conversation initially, but the tension in the air was palpable. Finally, after the waiter served the wine and walked away, Roderick leaned slightly over the table. "So, you said you needed to talk about some things. I'm listening." Mary Ann took a sip of wine, more to buy time than out of a desire to drink. "Roderick, before I begin, I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you is not easy for me. These are things I've never told anyone, not even Helen, and when I'm finished, you'll understand why this complicates any possibility of something happening between us." His expression became serious, but there was no judgment, only attention. "You can tell me. I promise to listen without interrupting." Mary Ann took a deep breath and began. "When I was 20, still in my third year of university, I made a terrible mistake. A mistake that haunts me to this day and has shaped all my choices ever since." She paused, gathering courage to continue. "At the time, I was very close to Helen. We were practically inseparable, and she was dating a guy named Brian. They had been dating for 2 years. It was a serious relationship. Brian was charismatic, funny, attentive. He treated Helen well, was kind to me too, always including his girlfriend's best friend in outings and dates." Roderick remained silent, but Mary Ann could see that he was beginning to understand where the story was going. "Helen went through a very difficult time then. Your mother became very ill, remember?" Roderick nodded. He was 24 at the time, already starting his career, but he remembered perfectly the scare his mother's illness had caused the family. "Helen was devastated. She spent her days at the hospital, could barely concentrate on university, was emotionally shattered, and I tried to help, tried to be present, but I was too young. I didn't know how to deal with it all." Mary Ann paused once more, her hands trembling slightly. "And Brian was also lost. He wanted to help Helen, but he didn't know. How she emotionally distanced herself from him, plunged into grief, and he started looking for solace elsewhere. He started talking more with me, opening up to me, and I, stupidly, mistook that for a true connection." The shame was almost physical, weighing on her shoulders. "We got involved. It was brief, intense, and completely wrong. It lasted less than 2 months, and during that time I looked at Helen every day, saw her suffering for her mother, trusting me as her best friend, and I was betraying that trust in the worst possible way." Roderick's jaw was tense, but he continued listening. "When your mother finally got better and was discharged, Helen began to emotionally recover. She started opening up to Brian again, and that's when he and I realized the enormity of what we had done. We ended things immediately. He never told Helen, and I didn't either. But that wasn't all," Mary Ann continued, her voice growing softer. "A few weeks after breaking up with Brian, I found out I was pregnant." Roderick's eyes widened, clearly not expecting that revelation. "I was 20, Roderick. I was in my third year of university, without money, without structure, and I had gotten pregnant by my best friend's boyfriend. I panicked. I didn't tell anyone. Not Brian, not Helen, not my family. I hid the pregnancy for months, wearing loose clothes, inventing excuses, and when the baby was born—" The tears began to fall, but she continued. "When the baby was born, I looked at that perfect little face for just a few seconds before signing the voluntary surrender documentation for adoption. I didn't want to know the name they would give her. I didn't want to know who would adopt her. I just signed the papers and left the hospital as if I could leave it all behind." She wiped the tears with the back of her hand. "But I never left it behind. I carried it every day for 15 years. The guilt, the shame, the pain of knowing there was a child in the world who came from me and whom I abandoned. And I built an entire life around that secret. I never allowed myself to get close to anyone, never allowed myself to have a serious relationship, because how could I? How could I let someone truly know me carrying this?" Mary Ann looked directly into Roderick's eyes. "And then a few months ago you came into my life, and for the first time in 15 years I felt something. I wanted to open up. I wanted to try. But then I found out you're Helen's brother, and everything became even more complicated because—" She paused, hesitating. "Because?" Roderick encouraged gently. "Because there's a possibility that the daughter I gave up for adoption is Laura." The silence that followed was deafening. Roderick was completely still, processing that information. The dates match, Mary Ann continued, her voice now just a whisper. The location matches. The details. Helen told me about the adoption match. I'm not absolutely sure yet. I did a DNA test and I'm waiting for the results, but... Roderick, there's a good chance that the girl you love as a niece is my biological daughter. And if she is, how does that leave things? How can I be with you knowing this? How can I look at Helen and not tell her? How can I look at Laura and not reveal it? Roderick ran a hand over his face, clearly shaken. My God, Mary Ann, this is... I know. It's a lot. It's too much. And that's why I can't return your feelings. Not until I find out the truth, and even after I don't know if I can. Because if Laura is my daughter, Helen deserves to know. But if I tell her, I lose the best friend I've ever had. I lose your trust. I lose everything. Roderick was silent for a long moment, looking at the wine in the glass in front of him. You carried this alone for 15 years, he finally said, his voice laden with emotion. I did. Mary Ann, look at me. She raised her eyes, expecting to see anger, disappointment, perhaps even repulsion, but what she saw was compassion. What you did with Brian was wrong. I won't pretend it wasn't. You betrayed my sister's trust in a serious way. But, Mary Ann, you were 20 years old. You were scared, lost, and made bad decisions in a moment of vulnerability. That doesn't define who you are today. Roderick, let me finish. About the pregnancy, about giving your daughter up for adoption. That wasn't a mistake. It was a difficult decision, even courageous. You recognized that you weren't in a position to raise a child, and you gave her the chance to have a better life. And if that child really is Laura, then you gave her the best mother she could have. You gave her my sister, who loves her more than anything in this world. Tears flowed freely down Mary Ann's face now. But what about Helen? How do I tell her this? I don't know, but I know that when the test results come, if they confirm Laura is your daughter, you can't keep carrying this alone. Helen will be shocked, maybe even hurt initially, but she's a good person, she'll understand. And more importantly, she'll want you to be a part of Laura's life in whatever way Laura wants. And what about us? Mary Ann asked, almost afraid of the answer. Roderick reached across the table and took Mary Ann's hand in his. I won't lie and say this doesn't complicate things. It complicates them a lot. But Mary Ann, what I feel for you hasn't changed. If anything, it's only grown. You're even braver than I imagined. And if you give me a chance, if you let me be by your side while you navigate all of this, I promise, I'll be here, no matter what happens. Mary Ann couldn't hold back anymore. She let the tears fall, years of pain and loneliness finally finding an outlet. Roderick stood up, came to her side, and pulled her into a tight embrace. There, in the corner of that discreet restaurant, Mary Ann finally allowed someone to hold her as she broke down. The following days were strange, but also curiously liberating. Mary Ann had told her secret, at least to one person, and the sky hadn't fallen. Roderick remained by her side, more present than ever, but respectful, giving her the space she needed to process everything. At work, they maintained professionalism, but there was a new layer of intimacy that hadn't existed before. Small knowing glances, deeper conversations during lunches, supportive messages throughout the day. And then, on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the revealing dinner, Mary Ann received an email from the lab. The DNA test results were ready. She was at home when the email arrived, still in her pajamas, drinking coffee. Her hands trembled so much that she almost dropped the cup when she picked up her phone. She took several deep breaths before clicking the link and entering the password to access the results. The screen loaded slowly, each second feeling like an eternity. And then, there it was. In black letters on a white background, cold and objective. Genetic match detected. Relationship index, mother and daughter. Probability, 99.9%. Laura. It was Laura. Mary Ann held the phone against her chest and let the tears fall once more. But this time, they weren't just tears of pain. They were also tears of relief. Relief at finally being certain. Relief at knowing her daughter had grown up, loved, protected, happy. relief at knowing that Helen unknowingly had cared for the baby she couldn't care for. She picked up the phone and called Roderick. He answered on the second ring. "Mary Ann, are you okay?" "The results came," she said, her voice choked. "It's her. Laura is my daughter." Silence on the other end of the line. Then his voice, soft and firm. "Where are you?" "At home." "I'm coming over." 20 minutes later, Roderick was at her apartment door. Mary Ann opened it, and he pulled her into a hug without saying a word. Sometimes words were unnecessary. They sat on the sofa, and Mary Ann showed him the results. Roderick read everything carefully, and when he finished, he placed the phone on the coffee table and looked at her. "And now? Now I need to tell Helen. Do you want me to be there when you tell her?" Mary Ann thought for a moment. "No, I think it needs to be just me and her, at least initially. I betrayed her trust, so I need to face the music." "You're not alone in this anymore, Mary Ann. Remember that." She took his hand and intertwined their fingers. "I know. And I have. No idea what I did to deserve your understanding, but I'm grateful for it. You don't need to deserve it, Mary Ann. Affection isn't earned. It simply exists, or it doesn't. And I choose to be by your side." That afternoon, Mary Ann called Helen and arranged to meet for coffee the next day, Wednesday, at a quiet place near her clinic. Helen accepted animatedly, unsuspecting of anything, and Mary Ann spent the rest of the day and all night mentally rehearsing what she would say, how she would begin, how she would explain 15 years of lies by omission. On Wednesday morning, she put on a simple dress, tied back her hair, applied just a little mascara. She didn't want to look like she was trying to impress or hide. She just wanted to be herself, vulnerable and honest. The cafe was a charming establishment in Notting Hill, with tables on the pavement and a relaxed atmosphere. Helen was already there when Mary Ann arrived, smiling and waving animatedly. "Mary, I've missed you. You've been so busy with the project I barely see you anymore." They hugged and sat down. They ordered coffee and cheese bread, chatted about pleasantries for a few minutes. But Mary Ann knew she needed to get to the point before she lost her courage. "Helen, I need to tell you something. Something very important and very difficult." Helen's expression changed immediately, becoming concerned. "Are you okay? Are you sick?" "It's not that. It's about the past. About something I did a long time ago and never had the courage to tell you." Helen took her friend's hand across the table. "Mary, you're scaring me. Whatever it is, you can tell me. We've been best friends for so long, there's nothing you can say that will change that." Mary Ann wished that were true. "Remember when we were in our 3rd year of university and your mother got sick?" Helen nodded, her expression growing more serious. "Of course, I remember. It was one of the worst times of my life." "Helen, at that time Brian and we got involved." Helen's face went completely white. She dropped Mary Ann's hand as if she had been burned. You and Brian. I know there's no excuse. I know it was horrible. Betrayal of the worst kind. You were suffering, needing me, and I—" Helen stood up from the table abruptly. "You slept with my boyfriend, while I was at the hospital taking care of my dying mother. You, my best friend." People at surrounding tables started to look, but Mary Ann didn't care. "Helen, please, sit down. There's more. There's something else you need to know." "There's more? What else could there be?" "Please." Helen, still trembling with anger and shock, sat back down, but kept her arms crossed defensively over her chest. "I got pregnant. From that involvement with Brian, I got pregnant." Helen's eyes widened even further. "And I didn't tell anyone. I hid the pregnancy. And when the baby was born, a girl, I gave her up for adoption. It was on March 15th, 15 years ago." Mary Ann saw the exact moment Helen connected the dots. Color returned to her face, but now it was a different color, of understanding and disbelief mixed. "No, it's not possible. I did a DNA test, Helen. Laura is my biological daughter." The silence that followed was devastating. Helen became completely still. as if she had been frozen in time. "Laura," she finally whispered, "my Laura, is your daughter." "Helen, you knew. All this time, you knew." "No, I only suspected recently, when you told me the details of the adoption and the dates matched. That's why I did the test. I needed to be sure." Helen covered her face with her hands. Her shoulders trembled. My God, Mary Ann. How could you? How could you keep this from me for so long? I was afraid of losing you, afraid of losing Laura, afraid of destroying her life. She's happy, Helen. You are a wonderful mother. I didn't want to mess that up." Helen raised her face and tears were streaming down her cheeks. "But now you're telling me. Why? Why now?" "Because I can't carry this alone anymore, and because Laura deserves to know the truth, if she wants to know. And you deserve to know too." Helen was silent for a long moment, wiping away her tears, trying to process too much information at once. "Did you tell anyone else?" Mary Ann hesitated, but decided to be completely honest. "I told Roderick." "My brother? You told my brother before you told me?" "Things got complicated between me and him. He has feelings for me, and I for him, but I couldn't move forward without being honest about my past." Helen let out a bitter laugh. Of course you and Roderick are getting involved. Why not? Since you have a history of getting involved with men in my family." The barb hurt, but Mary Ann knew she deserved it. "Helen, I understand you're angry. You have every right to be. But please don't decide anything now. Go home, process all of this, and then we'll talk about what to do next." Helen stood up again, this time grabbing her bag. "I need to go. I can't stay here right now." "Helen, please." "No, Mary Ann, not now. I need time." And with that, Helen left the cafe, leaving Mary Ann alone with her cold coffee and the overwhelming weight of uncertainty about the future. She had told the truth. Finally. But what would come next? No one could predict.